Corsair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Candy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we played, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, ST Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we played, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST. Commodore 64.
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
At his Radio Shack Color Computer 3,
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
a wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 126 of the Floppy Days Podcast with yours truly, Randy Kindig as the host. Everyone, and I mean everyone, listening to this podcast has surely heard of the groundbreaking application for its time, VisiCalc. VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet computer program for personal computers, originally released for the Apple II by VisiCorp on October 17, 1979. It's considered the killer application for the Apple II, turning the microcomputer from a hobby for computer enthusiasts into a serious business tool. And then it even encouraged IBM to introduce the IBM PC 2 years later. More than 700,000 copies were sold in 6 years, and up to 1 million copies over its history. Initially developed for the Apple II computer, VisiCalc was ported to numerous platforms, both 8-bit and some of the early 16-bit systems, such as the Commodore PET, the Atari 8-bit, the TRS-80 via TRIS-DOS, CP/M, MS-DOS, and even the HP Series 80. VisiCalc was later replaced in the market by Lotus 1-2-3 and eventually by Microsoft's Excel, which is the dominant spreadsheet today. Spreadsheets, along with word processors and presentation tools, are still today considered one of the key applications for computing. Bob Frankston, along with Dan Bricklin, are the co-inventors of VisiCalc. This month, we have an interview with the aforementioned Bob Frankston. Bob was kind enough to take time to talk with me about what it was like to create such a groundbreaking tool. Before doing that, I have a few new acquisitions to discuss, and I'll tell you about upcoming computer shows. I want to quickly mention a couple of sponsors for the show. 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts, is a great place to get vintage computer items, including video cables, power supplies, PC boards, cartridges, upgrades, and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. I often talk about things that I've acquired from 8bitclassics.com on this podcast. Corey has been a friend of the show for some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out his site. He has some great stuff. Also, ArcadeShopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, is another terrific place to get vintage computer items. Greg has a wide variety of hard-to-find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site that I do and have done a lot of shopping at and have mentioned numerous times on Floppy Days. If anything shows out of stock, just ping Greg through the contact form, and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. I also want to mention those listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through Patreon.com. This includes Jason Moore, Tony Capolini, Simon McCullough, Quentin Barnes, Lawrence, Joss Malone, Chris Petzel, Andy Collins, Richard Goldstone, Brendan Donahue, Ost, and Gary Heather. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running the podcast. Okay, let's get on with the show.
This is Bob Frankston, co-developer of the first electronic spreadsheet, VisiCalc, and you're listening to the Floppy Days Podcast.
Okay, now I'm going to get into new acquisitions and what I've been up to. There's quite a bit to talk about this month. I've had quite a bit of activity going on. One of the first things I've been up to is being involved in the organization and execution of the Indie Classic Expo. This was the first of what the Indie Vintage Computer Club hopes will be an annual event. This event was reasonably well attended for being the first one and was held at a hotel near the Indianapolis airport. Now, hopefully you were able to come, but we estimate about 140 people came through the door. We had a couple of vendors at the show as well, notably Jim Brain and his Retro Innovations, and Corey Colts with his 8-Bit Classics. We had about a total of 30 tables with exhibits for the show, including yours truly. I had a Floppy Days and Antique table set up with an Atari 8-bit. We made enough money to pretty much cover the cost of putting on the show with sponsorships. Floppy Days was a sponsor, by the way. Entrance fees, t-shirt sales, and table rentals. Plans are already underway for next year's show, and we're trying to find ways to get more contributions and a larger venue. I will say it was fun to have the group put on its own show, and we're really going to try to make this an annual event as long as there's interest. Next are my adventures with the Atari Mega STE. Now, it turns out that the Mega STE is one of the, I would call it white whales for me. It's something I've always wanted. It has the Blitter chip in it, which the earlier machines did not have. Easy RAM upgrades. It has an internal hard drive connection and cover. And just the unique design of the STE is something I was always interested in. It's totally different design than the Mega ST. I have a Mega ST1 as well, and the STE, just the sort of blocky design, I really like it. It's also the latest of the ST desktop models, so I've always wanted one. I've always been looking online to try to find one at a good price, but it's really hard to find one in the U.S. because they were fairly rare in the U.S. They sold much better abroad. And so I decided to look abroad to see if I could find one, probably in Europe where they sold really well, and maybe I could get one at a lower price, even with the shipping. Now, I found one without a keyboard or mouse, which was not a problem because my Mega ST1 keyboard and mouse would work just fine with it. It would have been nice, honestly, to have the Mega STE keyboard, as the joystick and mouse connectors are on the side of the keyboard instead of underneath, which I always thought was a really poor design for the Mega ST keyboard. Also, the nice thing about the Mega STE is that it has a power supply that works with European or US power, so that wasn't an issue. Now, I found one that included the hard drive and 4 meg of RAM, and I contacted the seller, and he had just installed German TOS 2.06 ROMs, which were the latest ROMs put out by Atari for the STE machines. He agreed to a price, and he said he would include purchasing and installing US TOS 2.06 ROMs. So that was perfect, and I purchased it from him. So it arrived after a couple of weeks. I was worried because it's always a crapshoot when you're trying to order from abroad, And I could see that it arrived in the United States, but then I quit getting any updates at that point. So I figured it was held up in customs or something, and I was a little worried about it. It seemed to sit like that for several days, and I was starting to get a little worried. However, it did arrive after 2 to 3 weeks, and the box looked fine. However, when I removed the hard disk cover to take a look inside, it turns out that the front hard drive screw post had broken in transit. This caused the hard drive to hang down and put pressure on the hard drive cover. So it caused a couple of small cracks and compromised the structural integrity of that hard drive cover. And it turned out the hard drive also no longer worked. It apparently had been jostled around too much. So I contacted the seller, and he really worked with me to make it right. He agreed to order a brand new TT disk drive cover from Best, which fit the STE, although it has a white color rather than the beige color of the STE. And he had it sent to me. He also offered to send me another hard drive, but I didn't really care about that, as I had recently purchased an ASCII to SD external drive. In the meantime, I decided to glue the current hard drive cover back together and use the TT cover as a backup. The glue appears to have worked, and the cover seems stable, and you really have to know the cracks are there to even see them. I do appreciate the eBay seller working with me to sell me a Mega STE at a reasonable price, and for working with me to make it right. In all honesty, the hard drive should have been removed from the STE prior to shipping, and shipped separately, so hopefully we all learn from this. I now have an awesome Mega STE, something I always wanted to own. Next up, I purchased a couple of new Raspberry Pis for projects that I have in mind. One of the Pis is a 3A+, which is exactly what's needed for the PiStorm project. PiStorm is an adapter which uses a Raspberry Pi to provide a CPU accelerator, graphics card, hard disk interface, Wi-Fi, and other enhancements to an Amiga 500. The other Pi I bought is a Pi Zero WH, which is starting to be used in a lot of projects today, especially with the increased rarity and cost for the larger Raspberry Pis these days. Next, I wanted to talk about some Jiffy DOS ROMs that I got. A few months ago, I mentioned I had purchased Jiffy DOS ROMs for the Commodore 128D that I got in the barn find. Jiffy DOS is a disk I/O speedup solution that works with the Commodore 64 line of computers. The 64, the 128, the SX64. It requires that you install a Jiffy DOS ROM in the computer and another one in the drive. Back in episode 124, I talked about the SX64 I got in the barn find and the work that Lige of the YouTube show The Commodore Room did to fix it up and get it working. After playing with the machine, I've gotten a bit fond of it and really considering keeping it, where originally I thought I'd play with it a bit and then sell it. I decided to go ahead and invest in the Jiffy DOS ROMs for that machine to speed up disk access from Jim Brain at Retro Innovations, who was at the Indie Classic Expo. I haven't installed them yet, but they're in my possession. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the Osborne Ones and the Osborne Executive and an update on the Great Barn Find. It's hard to believe, and it's been a long journey, but I'm just about finished with processing all the items from the Great Barn Find. I have 2 machines yet to sell from the find, that being one of the Amiga 1000s and the other being a nice PC Junior. I'm going to list them locally first and eventually might end up listing them on eBay. I still do have some peripherals, power supplies, joysticks, cables, etc. to clean up still out in my barn, but it's really a small amount compared to their initial pile. The final machines I had left untested were 2 Osborne 1s and 1 Osborne Executive. All of these machines look pretty good from the outside, but based on my experience with other machines, and not knowing how well the Osbornes hold up over time, I really didn't expect any of them to work. I got a really pleasant surprise in that regard, although I had a bit of a setback. The first Osborne 1 I tested fired right up to my surprise. I played with it a bit and decided to let it run a while to get it warmed up. In retrospect, that was probably not the best decision, as after the fact I found that these machines quite often will blow capacitors after such a long time in storage. Sure enough, about 30 minutes after I let the machine sit while turned on, something made a loud popping sound and smoke started coming out of the machine. My first blown cap. I quickly turned it off and opened some windows. Now it appears I have some work to do to get this machine up and running again, but it's good to know the rest of the machine appears to be functional. The second Osborne 1 would not fire up when I turned it on. Perhaps it already lost a cap and it needs cap replacement work. Not sure yet. The Osborne Executive fired right up and appears fully functional. I didn't push my luck on this one and turned off the Executive after confirming its functionality. However, I was very encouraged by this because the Executive came with the full set of software and manuals that they came with back in the day. After discussing this with the Indie Club, I decided to purchase cap replacement kits for all 3 machines. I found a website called Console 5 that has these cap kits pre-assembled for many different machines. He has the kits for the Osborne 1, but hasn't made a kit for the Executive, and in fact asked me to disassemble it and take pictures of the boards so he can confirm what caps are needed. I'm going to take all 3 machines to the next club meeting and enlist help in troubleshooting and cap replacement with the Osborne 1 kits in hand. Stay tuned as I work through that, and I'll let you know how it comes out. And that's it for new acquisitions and what I've been up to this month.
Hi, it's Earl Evans, retro computing podcaster and enthusiast, and you're listening to Randy Kindig on the Floppy Days Podcast.
All right, now for upcoming shows. There have already been a few shows this year in April and May, but there are a lot of shows left in 2023. The show season is really just kind of getting started here. So in June, there are several. The first is the 64 bits or less Retro Gaming Festival, June 3rd through the 4th at the Benton County Fairgrounds in Corvallis, Oregon. And this one is sponsored by the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. June 23rd through the 25th will be the Boatfest Vintage Computer Exposition in Hurricane, West Virginia. VCF Southwest will be that same weekend, June 23rd through the 25th, at the Davidson Gundy Alumni Center at the University of Texas at Dallas in Richardson, Texas. Also that same weekend will be the Pacific Commodore Expo Northwest version 4, June 24th through the 25th at the Interim Computer Museum in Seattle, Washington. In July 1st through the 2nd will be the Kickstart Amiga UK Expo in Nottingham, UK. Kansas Fest, there will be 2 parts to that one. July 18th through the 23rd will be the in-person event, and July 29th through the 30th will be the virtual event, and the in-person event is held at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri. July 20th through the 30th will be the Southern Fried Gaming Expo and VCF Southwest in Atlanta, Georgia. August 12th will be Zap Live 2023 at the Holiday Inn, Kenilworth, CV8 1ED in the UK. Couple of international shows here. Silly Venture Summer Edition will be August 17th through the 20th in Gdańsk, Poland. And Fujiyama will be held August 30th through September 3rd in Langenfeld, Germany. September 9th through the 10th will be VCF Midwest at the Waterford Banquets and Conference Center in Elmhurst, Illinois. Tandy Assembly will be September 29th through October 1st at the Courtyard by Marriott in Springfield, Ohio. October 14th through the 15th will be AMI West in Sacramento, California. That's an Amiga show. Portland Retro Gaming Expo will be held October 13th through the 15th at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland, Oregon. The Chicago TI International World Fair, October 14th in Evanston, Illinois at the Evanston Public Library. And finally, December 2nd through 3rd will be the World of Commodore at the Admiral Inn, Mississauga, Ontario. So that's all the events I know of. Again, that's a lot of events. And hope to see you at one or more. That's it for upcoming computer shows. So I'm here today with Bob Frankston, who is the co-developer of VisiCalc. I'm sure everyone's heard of VisiCalc. And
few people have.
It was certainly the precursor of things like Excel that everyone uses today. So Bob, great to have on you here today. Could you start out maybe just by talking about where you live and what you do today?
Okay. I'm continuing to live in Massachusetts, where I moved here from the great city of Brooklyn back in '67.
Okay.
I actually live a block away from Dan Brooklyn.
Oh, okay. You're pretty close then to where Dan is. Okay. And he was your co-developer.
Well, he came up with the idea.
Yeah. Okay.
But he was too busy in school to do it. But, definitely, develop cable. And I'm living in Newton, Massachusetts. So any of you ever eaten a Fig Newton? It's named after Newton, Massachusetts.
I did not know that. I love Fig Newtons. Yeah. They're great.
Not after physicists, after the city. It's real.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us how you got started with computers, Bob, if you wouldn't mind.
How much time do you have?
However much time you have.
Well, I've always been interested, and in January of 1963, Hunter College got an IBM 1620 and wanted to teach the faculty how to use computers. But I was in junior high school, so I went instead of my mother. And it made sense to me. And then a few years later, I got a job on Wall Street implementing one of the first online services in 1966 using the Berkeley Project Genie machine. So that really got me into the world of real-time computing. I took a terminal home, been online ever since. So in a sense, I've been doing personal computing since then. But all the time I was, doing my own computing. But it was personal computing online that was much sort of like what we have today. And I manage, every other time I apply to MIT, I get in. Every other time I don't. So I had a chance to be involved in some of the early projects there. But I've always been intrigued by, the thing about that first job was hands-on. I can go, do things to the machine. And I've always been interested in, sort of how it works from the soldering level all the way up. So, after my time, mainframe, large systems, and I continued that, personal computers happened. And there's a company I was working for, or needed somebody to do a language for their 6502-based computer. Now, this computer happened to support up to 16 megabytes on 6502's multiple CPUs and everything, but it gave me good practice on the 6502. And it was actually a very highly interactive BASIC, can do types. It's a very extensible BASIC-like language. And that gave me the experience in the 6502. So when Dan came up with this idea, but he was too busy, for me, it felt like a fun project to implement. I should be able to do it at 16K. How many of your listeners know how much 16K is?
Most of the listeners of this podcast understand and worked with 16K, back in the day. So
okay, but I failed. Needed 32K.
So this was a custom computer that they built and just used for their business?
Well, VisiCalc I did on the Apple II, but the computer before was that many companies are trying to build their own personal computer. So they'd made money selling a digital capacitance meter. And the next thing to be a personal computer. The problem is it made some minor mistakes, like you realize you're supposed to sell it below what it costs you to make it. And, it was over-engineered, and this toy Apple II won out.
Right. So you said Dan Bricklin had the idea for VisiCalc. How did that come about? How did you two end up talking about this and deciding to take that idea and go with it?
Okay. Well, back in 1970, we met. Dan showed up at MIT. And his first assignment was to implement my bachelor's thesis on Multics. I don't know how many people ever heard of Multics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, the toy version is called Unix. We decided one day we'd go into business together. It just took a few years. Dan has a great TEDx talk on coming up with the concept of this and pointing. And we both had experience, with screens and programming Emacs and things like that. Dan did the deck word processors and programs for newspapers. So familiar with the basic concept of screens, so it all made sense. So he was busy, looked like a fun project. I was available, figured $2 an hour, what the hell, that can pay enough. So I started to do the project, and I had some experience working with personal software before, because we were pitching a BASIC for the Texas Instrument TI 99.4, and then I did another project to convert a BASIC program from the TRS-80 to the Apple II, and I had to use an SX70 to make the listing, take a picture of each screen. So that got me practice in working in personal computers with personal software. So the pieces were in place there. So I basically worked on Dan did a very simple mock-up, and then I started to do a prototype of the real version. And we never did do the production version. We just shipped the prototype.
You just shipped the prototype. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So you guys decided just to take that idea and start Software Arts. And who did most of the programming for VisiCalc itself? Did you do most of that work?
Yes, because Dan was still in school. But it was very well, because Dan knew how to do the programming. But it meant he was free to do user interface design and think about the interaction. Because whenever you design a program, you don't want to make a change. It's not worth doing, But because he wasn't doing the coding, he can ask features. But he understood the coding, and I understood the business need, so he can negotiate. So, we can leverage this feature, this can use on top of this. And then when it came to writing the reference card, this is too hard to explain. Let's make it easy to explain. So modify the program rather than trying to explain something to users. And we did have compromises. I had to drop the interactive help system because the calculator would take 2,000 bytes. And,
didn't have it. Didn't have it right. Yeah.
Instead, we tried to make it a very simple reference card, which Dan put together and had his father print.
So did the limitations of the PC that you were building it for, the Apple II, is that pretty much what drove what functionality you were able to put into the tool?
It was a factor. I mean, the functionality was basic, but what it helped channel our thinking, so it was highly interactive with just the keyboard and the arrow keys. Mm-hmm. And I think that constraint did make it better, because instead of trying, how can we make a graphics feature shaded, we just made the basic function very accessible. And it turns out, if you do it, you resonate with the user, and it seems natural, the computer disappears because we never forgot we were creating illusions so that people can get their job done. And if they didn't know there was a program there, we'd succeeded. They were just looking into the mirror at what they were thinking and expressed it.
Okay, so when was it actually announced, and in what way did you roll it out when you had something that you were prepared to,
Well, at that point, we had a marketing split with Personal Software and Software Arts. So they were responsible for the rollout, and they basically sent copies to most dealers who had no idea what to do with it, since they didn't know accounting. Mm-hmm. No wonder any of the stores failed. But it resonated with key users, especially those on Wall Street, who could fund the industry. We announced it to the industry internally, or we weren't there, but Personal Software did, to Ben Rosen's conference, and then publicly at the National Computer Conference in New York in June of 1979. To great, what's that?
What is this thing you guys has put out here? So, did you find that there was a lot of training needed? No,
for the target market, it was natural. You didn't need much training.
Okay, it was just getting some of the industry people to really understand what it was about, not the users so much.
Yeah, it was a channel problem. For the target market financial people, as far as they were concerned, they basically went to the petty cash drawer and bought an Apple II. And
so, at the time you rolled this out in '79, the Apple II was pretty much. I mean, there was the TRS-80 Model 1, and there was also the Commodore PET. Yes. But you chose just to put it out initially on the Apple II, correct?
Yeah, that was really a personal software decision, but Apple II seemed ahead at the time, and they'd served the supply of floppy disk drives, which gave them an advantage. So one of the secrets we never told people is we had cassette support in the initial version.
Oh, okay.
You could save the cassette and load from cassette.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to implement my own, retrofit the file system. Also, we didn't sign license, so we had to program it all ourselves from scratch. But basically, it was having that floppy drive that I think was a key.
What kind of response did you actually get from the users? I mean, do you recall?
Well, from the target users, religious awe. From the non-target users, no reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, eventually people started to figure out, but even today, I don't use spreadsheets much. I mean, I'll use them occasionally, but for the most part, they're not central to what I do. But for those users for whom it's central, it's key. One of the things we discovered was it was for mid-level managers. Most senior managers didn't do the calculations. They had people do it for them. But for those people, it was a big. Well, there were two kinds of changes. One, accountants immediately saved weeks of their time. But the other market was basically it reduced the need for an MIS, Management Information Services Department, and eliminated it as replaced by an Information Technologies Department.
Makes sense. Okay. Yeah. It's said that VisiCalc sold a lot of Apple II computers,
yes, Jobs
right?
Said that.
Jobs
said, yes.
Did Apple ever contact you and talk to you about that, or?
Well, they didn't talk to us about that, but we spoke to Apple directly about some of the issues. Like, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but the day after I finally found the last bug in Apple III VisiCalc, they went public. So they were aware.
They went public with the Apple III?
Well, the IPO. They finally allowed their IPO to happen once I fixed that last bug.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay. So VisiCalc ended up getting developed for several different platforms besides the Apple II. Why did you decide to do that, and how did it sell on those other platforms?
Well, okay, this gets touchy. Obviously, we want to do the IBM PC. Mm-hmm. But we let Personal Software, which renamed itself VisiCorp, maintain the contract for that. The problem is that they became captured by VCs who want to keep us busy so they can develop a successor they didn't have to pay for. And that, VC naivete basically killed things by making us spend a lot of time on non-productive ports. Now, some of the ports before the Compact cloned the PC, made some sense, but it's a lot of IBM, like machines. And we wanted to do a port. Xerox had a computer, the Xerox A20, which was their CPM machine. And there was also a CPM machine from Sony. So those sort of made sense. Whether we would have chosen to do it was a separate issue because the market's much smaller. Much better to improve the main versions for IBM, Apple, Commodore, and then when Compact came for Compact. But instead, we had to work on the DEC Rainbow and Robin, which we knew were never going to get anywhere. But we did develop a technology, VisiCalc Advanced Version. We wrote our own language to implement it in. And so we had skills to do porting beyond that.
You wrote your own language in order to make it easier to port it to various machines?
Yes.
Huh. So what was that language? Was it like a Java sort of language where you would write in an intermediate code and then an interpreter on the other end, or how did that work?
Okay. So the geek explanation, the language itself was like the original version of JavaScript, which is Lisp-like syntax. But JavaScript they sugared up later to make it look like Java. But it was basically syntax using parentheses. We could have sugared it later. It generated an intermediate code, but initially we had interpreter, and that was considered too slow. So I wrote a compiler to compile it into machine code for the Z80 or the 8086. And that was a fun project.
It does sound like that would be fun. Yeah.
Yes,
awesome.
I was proud to do some clever. I even had to tell myself, if you knew the result was going to be a Boolean, you'd target it for the CX register because there's an instruction that would save you a byte. I won't code. In any case.
Well, in those days, you had to worry about every byte. That's yes. Certainly the case. Yeah. So
but it was also efficiency. I mean.
Yeah.
Occasionally have fun writing compilers.
So what language did you write it in initially if you ended up rewriting it later? When did you...
6502 assembler.
Oh, okay. Just 6502 assembly. Okay.
And the 80 version was basically a direct port by a very good programmer, but he didn't have to show off. He basically ported it one-to-one so he could maintain the two versions together.
So when did you start noticing this getting competition from Lotus 123, which came out later?
Okay. Now, so as I said, VisiCorp basically decided they didn't want to, they thought we were just kids on the East Coast publishing. They were smarter than we are. And they were going to do their own graphics interface, because they saw Xerox and everything. Of course, they were totally out of their depth in doing it. Didn't really understand, the skills it takes to fit within the constraints. Like you said, the constraint of the Apple II. So they basically did pedestrian mainframe programming to try to do a Xerox star on the Apple III. Or maybe the IBM PC, whatever. Let's say it did not go well for them. But in the process, they sued us and everything, and they really got their VisiCalc product manager angry. You might be able to guess his name because he left to form a company. He had a non-compete, but if he did a program that combined spreadsheets, database, and word processing, he was allowed to do it. You want to guess what the name is? Rich Cape.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, so their bad behavior created the competition. While they kept us busy on dead machines, Mitch was free to do 1, 2, 3, and was unfettered by them. And he also had all the relations and the people and everything in the market. So that was a jump start for 1, 2, 3. I mean, I'm not going to begrudge Mitch. He's a very good guy. But it was more VisiCorp and the VCs behind them that really didn't understand the finesse it takes to make everything balance.
Okay. So in 1982, Microsoft came out with a spreadsheet program as well called Multiplan.
Yeah. They didn't get it. So I posted something about the design decisions on implementing VisiCalc. RMF.vc/implementing VisiCalc, I think, is the key word. And I go through each of the design decisions, one of which was how do you refer to the cells? Okay. Now, mathematician would say, it's a 1, 2 in this. But we said, no, it's got to be like A1 because that's the way normal people would do it. But normally you have the letters down and the numbers across. But because we had to say, okay, well, you can do this for a year of production. It's got to be at least 52 across. We'll make it some more than that. But you don't have as many, it had a limited number across, but we could have any number of rows. So we said letters go at the top, rows go down. So it was every little thing was thought out like that. Multiplan was done by programmers who were not familiar, were not at business school, were not doing real spreadsheets for production planning in those applications. So they said R1, C1, which is not natural at all. So it's little decisions like that that made it a non-issue. They did a 16-bit version. They should have moved beyond that at that point. And then there was SuperCalc, which didn't even have arrow keys until Dan foolishly asked them. But by the time I kicked him, it was too late. So they had a thing. But again, they were on secondary platforms. They never really got that much traction. So that was, in fact, a competition. The only real competition was 1, 2, 3, and which happened to be by the VisiCalc product manager.
Right. Okay. So I know you've talked before, or Dan has talked before, about not ever getting a patent for VisiCalc because you couldn't at that time.
I even took a class in patent law, so I knew I couldn't do it.
Oh, okay. So at the time, it certainly was something that crossed your mind, but you just couldn't do it because, yeah. And it wasn't until 81, I guess, that it was eligible to get a patent, and by that time, you already had other competitors, right?
Well, I mean, yes, it was a little late.
Yeah. When did Software Arts or VisiCorp close its doors, and why?
Well, again, I think VisiCorp petered out, and we got acquired by Lotus. I think it was in '86. And the why was because what's a safe word to use for the behavior of VisiCorp? Basically, they were not exactly ethical players in this. So they tried to distract us things. We're going to be acquired by CompuServe, which is H&R Block, and they managed to somehow, by coincidence, their investment banker. There are a lot of reasons to be questionable. Basically, instead of finding a way to work together, they sought to kill us, and they succeeded. But they went down the process. But I think they just petered out.
As we all know, Microsoft eventually took over the spreadsheet market.
Yes.
With Excel. You eventually worked for Microsoft beginning in '93. Did that have anything to do with your...
Yeah, I worked for Lotus, too.
And you worked for Lotus, right. So you went from VisiCorp to Lotus and Microsoft. I don't know.
In the case, did I really work on the spreadsheet?
Right.
Except
okay.
That Lotus, like I would say, you idiots, why aren't you doing a graphics version? But,
Right. Okay. So what kind of work did you do when you went to Microsoft? So it was unrelated.
So Microsoft, one of my conditions was no reports, not be on the critical path for anything. So what I did, I think, in a sense, whether it's more important, less important than VisiCalc, was home networking. So today you assume you just bring a computer home, you plug in your home network, and it's just there. Well, in 1995, that wasn't the case. A couple of problems. First one, even when, you were still in the dial-up days, so each computer had a separate dial-up line, but what broadband was coming on when the cable company said, we have all this capacity, what else can we do with it? Oh, we hear there's this internet thing. Let's add that to the mix. So the idea was, just like when you got a new TV, the kids know that you would pay a monthly fee for each TV in those days. When you got a new phone number, every new service you bought had a monthly fee. And broadband was seen as a fat pipe, so the phone companies could sell, and the cable companies, same thing, could sell new services without new costs. Nirvana. So you got your second PC, you had a monthly fee for each line. Or because an IP address was treated like a phone number. So I happened to be commuting to Microsoft because Microsoft senior executives wanted me to move. My wife didn't. Guess who won?
I know how that goes.
Yes. So I waved in Montana as I passed. One day I'll actually get there on the ground. I did commute a lot.
You say Montana?
Well, yeah, I flew over the country, all these states.
Ah. The reason I asked about that is because I own property in Montana. So.
Well, you should have said Montana. That's why I mentioned it. Okay, but I know these states exist because they're down there on the ground as we flew across the country.
Yeah, I actually live in Indianapolis right now, but.
Okay, I've been there once.
Got property in Montana.
But, okay, so basically, because I learned about networking, I remember I was in class in May of 1973, and the kid next to me had his project using coaxial cables and ether. You can guess who that was. For you people who don't, that's Bob Metcalf.
Bob Metcalf, okay. Yeah,
so
who just got a big award. Yeah.
He just got the award, but he not, when he announced it to the class, he was sitting next to me.
Oh, really? Wow. Wow. That's pretty interesting.
It just, as I said, I just happened to be in the middle of things as I happen. So I understood the basic underlying concept of packets and how shareable they are and how the internet works at a very deep level. So I took on a project of all my computers in my house were networked to each other. The challenge was to interconnect them with the computers at the Microsoft campus across the country. So I'll go through all the details, but in effect, I basically said, okay, I want this to work for everyone. So my requirement was, now, you may be old enough to remember when the idea of people doing their own networks was considered impossible. You need a networking expert.
Right.
So my attitude was, the requirement was no installer. Everything just had a network. You just connected it in and it just worked. I didn't even want you to do any extra wires. So what I did was I developed, like a phone wire network and stuff. Turns out that all got mooted by Wi-Fi, which came along soon enough. But the key is to make sure that all the Windows machines shipped with IP in the box. And there was a new protocol called DHCP, so you didn't have to do any configuration. You just plug it together. And I made sure every Windows machine came with the NAT, Network Address Translation. Now, it turns out that it's easy to have an external box. So what your so-called router is really a NAT, a network translator, that allows you to share the single address from your provider. So you no longer had to pay a separate fee for each personal computer. You get as many computers as you want, and they'd all share a single connection. Now, the problem I faced at Microsoft was, first, they didn't believe anybody would have more than one computer at home. And it just seemed like, over the years, I come to realize how strange the idea is for most people about best efforts connectivity. Even to this day, very few people really understand how and why the internet works. Right? More to the point, why it succeeded. So basically, I made home networks possible. So now you can go and buy IP light bulbs, and they just work, and you don't pay a monthly fee for each. If I hadn't done that, some people might have been able to do it themselves, but few people would have got all the technology, would have got a separate computer to act as a router, or made their home machine. It wouldn't have worked out. So I think it took time, but I think that's really transformational. The fact that we have all these IP-based devices and you're not paying an extra fee for each one was, I think, an important contribution, because as far as I got, nobody else was doing it. And the companies, like at that point, Fuji sold a NAT, wouldn't have had a market if Windows didn't come ready to work with them. And it wouldn't have worked if I didn't do it with a consumer mentality that normal people could just bring it home and expect it to work. Now, there's an interesting footnote to this. Even though you didn't use the network address translation in the PC, you use an external box, that router, you notice today you can make any PC a hotspot. They've exposed that capability so you can now share your connection. So where you do have to pay, like at a hotel, you can now share that connection among all your devices. So that functionality is still there. But I'm really proud, because I think that's transformational. That has basically shifted the internet from something you visited occasionally to something that's integral, not simply to communication, social network, but also finally now to the devices in your house. So that was a long answer to your question.
Not a problem. It's very interesting that you got an opportunity to work on that at Microsoft. That's important.
I seized the opportunity.
You seized the opportunity. Okay.
And the secondary thing is it taught me a lot less. It became the point-person home control, and it gave me a deep understanding of how you define the relationship between endpoints. For example, today's internet is not really great for devices. It's really good for basically it was a network of networks and really great at the time, but we now need to move on to support peer connectivity, to have permanent links. I just posted an essay about why we need that. So these ideas are still central and playing it out. We're still at the earliest stages of implementing and understanding these capabilities.
Absolutely. Spreadsheets are still today, really a key application. I know that in business, personally, and everyone around me use spreadsheets all the time for all sorts of things. How do you feel about the work you did on VisiCalc that really brought this key piece of software to everybody?
No, I mean, it's really great to have had an impact like that. And I think part of it wasn't just programming skills. Dan and I both had, well over a decade of industry experience, professional level, with graphic screens, user interface, user experience. So, we understood how to create a whole product. I have to confess, one feature I left out of VisiCalc was significance analysis. So, if you did a lot of calculation, you're multiplying out one, at some point, each time you did a calculation, it loses significant digits. Mm-hmm. If I implemented it, it might have limited the use of spreadsheets, but most people have discovered that the results had no significance. If you do a 10-year projection where we have a 10% error bracket each year, though it's more like 50%, by the time you get to the 10th year projection, you might as well use a tarot card for all it's worth.
Yeah, good point.
So it is a big thing. I think it really is a powerful tool and everything, but it also gave what I said. Between my job on Wall Street, providing data, I've created a lot of weapons of mass financial destruction.
It makes it all look good, right? It makes it look like it's...
Oh, that's really what Quattro proved. It says the real value of the spreadsheet is making stuff look good, polishing it.
You're right. So I was going to ask you whether you stay in touch with Dan, but it sounds like you do. It sounds like you live really close to him. So you guys still talk frequently?
Oh, yeah. It's my website picture. That Dan took it.
Oh, okay.
He's a photographer, so he took the first reference cards, too.
You stay in touch with any of the other people that you were involved with in those days?
To varying degrees. Yeah, a lot of people, especially with Facebook and stuff, over the years. So yeah, some number of them. A lot of them have gone off to form illustrious careers. One of the people who works with Ray Ozzy's done very well. You might have seen Josh Bernoff's postings. So yeah, a number of the different people, stay in touch with.
Now, I see a lot of computers behind you there in the picture.
Yes.
Do you have any computers from the 80s, like an Apple II or anything like that you did work on?
I have. I didn't keep an Apple II, but I got acquired two. One was for my father-in-law, but they weren't in good shape. So there's a computer museum in Jamaica Plain, which I need to visit, who offered to upgrade them, refurbish them in return for being able to keep one of them. So I need to go over and get my other one, but I also want to go and take a tour of it. I have lots of little things, Magic Link from the 90s. I've got an IXO brick someplace, which is about the shape of a brick, but in the early 80s was one of the first alphanumeric page and communicating device with a keyboard.
Oh, okay.
So I've got various things. I've given a lot to the Computer History Museum, but I've got various pieces and stuff around. I still have a modem from 1966.
Do you? From 1966? Yes. I'll bet that was a fast one.
Oh, it could go to blazing 30 CPS, but I only ran it at 10 CPS.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you don't want to burn it out.
Teletypes.
What about the original software code from the very first version of VisiCalc? Is that preserved somewhere? I'm just curious.
Well, did you ever see Indiana Jones, the first movie, where
sure.
they take the ark and they put it in the back of a warehouse?
Mm-hmm.
So we made backup tapes, only one set, foolishly, and Lotus was holding on to them for us, part of the acquisition. When it was leaving us, asked the tape, said, "Oh, well, lawyers need in case of suits." Okay, so somewhere in the IBM warehouse, there are those tapes with the source on them.
Okay.
I just saw some later versions, but not of that version.
It probably would be a problem just getting it off of the tapes these days, wouldn't it?
Well, there are enough places. I mean, if I had the tapes, and I can do it.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, Bob. That's all the questions I had. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before I let you go?
I don't know. I mean, the real impact for me has been, seeing that you can have an impact on the world. So right now, I'm trying to sort of give us post-internet connectivity. In other words, the telecom industry is a legacy of the 19th century, when the design point of a phone was 2 tin cans and string. Because after all, in one sense, it was just a microphone, the other end is just a speaker and nothing more. And that string is a wire, but you had to hold it taut to preserve the wavelength. So you buy telephony as a service, that would cover the cost of the infrastructure, which is really, in the end of it, just keeping that wavelength in shape or the string taut. Today, phone calls are applications in our devices, and we need infrastructure, which is paid for directly because since the phone calls are apps, that money does not go to pay for the infrastructure. That's why we have broadband subsidies. The problem is that we're discovering all sorts of new things we can do, devices and connected devices, like connected healthcare and stuff, but we're stuck with the ancient model of telephony. And a key part of it, one of my essays is called VoIP Inflection. And it explains how VoIP is fundamentally a different concept from telephone calls. There's no wavelength. There's no information in the middle. And that does go back to the class that Bob and I took in 73, and understanding decoupling packets or best efforts connectivity and what we do with it. So right now, I'm trying to sort of enable people to own their own connectivity so devices can just work anywhere. There's no concept of digital divide due to the inability to pay, because there's nobody trying to prevent you from communicating, simply to collect a fee based on a business model that made sense 100 years ago but no longer does. So these ideas all play together, and it makes me think also why spreadsheets work. Remember, spreadsheets, at least classically, know nothing. They're just a mirror on you. You put your knowledge in. So these ideas all come together in basically how you, I guess, jumping a little ahead, is on that first job, what I was doing was on Wall Street was creating tools for others to use. I was empowering people. Spreadsheets are a tool to empower people. Home networks empower people. Now I'm trying to empower people by giving them infrastructure as a resource rather than as a limitation. And some of those ideas, again, are coming up together and trying to understand how things like ChatGPT work. But that's another conversation in its own right. So I don't know how much that makes sense, but I'm having fun.
Okay, well, good. That's good.
And those devices, I learned by building stuff. Right.
So anything you want to say to the Floppy Days listeners before we jump off here?
What major lessons are? Does anybody have a USB-based 5.25-inch floppy drive I can just plug into my system?
I think I've got one sitting around somewhere. USB? I don't know.
If somebody, I'll buy one just so I can read those old floppies more easily.
Gotcha. I really appreciate your time, Bob. Really do. And I'll let you know when it's published.
Okay. And I'll put a pointer on my site.
Okay. All right. Well, very good.
This is fun.
Enjoy the rest of your day, sir.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, that's it for the show this month. I want to give out special thanks to Bob Frankston for taking his time to talk with us about what it was like to create such a unique program, a game changer as VisiCalc. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Just go to floppydays.com for the full list. Please provide feedback for the show. You can do that at Apple Podcasts or on the website, via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via Twitter at @floppydays, or on Mastodon at floppydays@oldbytes.space. On Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays, or on the Discord server, whose link can be found at floppydays.com. Besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming at TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher.com, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye.